Hello, everyone. Sam back here with another monthly wrap up. Once again, we're still trying out this tier list method that we did last month. I'm working on improving this setup. Just a brief housekeeping note. You'll notice I've added a couple of extra tiers here of things that I realized needed a little bit of tweaking. We'll get to that later on in the video, and I'm still working on getting a better microphone for this because the main microphone I use for my videos doesn't exactly work well with my computer. Something you don't care about, but today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in February, and then we're going to be ranking them here on this tier list. Um, so first off, just be sure to comment below things that you read in February, especially the books that you would recommend. I always appreciate getting extra recommendations. As you'll see here, this is a lot more than my average month. I'd say probably 2 to 3 books more than my average. But there was also a lot of variety in the books that I went through this month. So the first book we're going to talk about here is Savage Son by Jack Carr. So this is book 3 in his James Reese Terminalist thriller series. Obviously, that began with The Terminalist. And where are we going to drop this? We're going to drop this in good. Okay? Savage Son is a good novel. So I love that first novel in this series, The Terminalist. It is probably one of my favorite thriller novels of all time. I've read it or gone through it twice now, and book 2 in the series, True Believer, is not bad. I just find it to be very okay. Like, nothing special, just okay. And so both times when I've gone through the series, I've kind of stalled out in book 2, but this time, what was the last time I went through True Believer? Probably a few months ago, because I was like, well, I should keep going on with the series and stalled out again. Finally finished Savage Son, and it is markedly better than True Believer. True Believer, and I even own a copy of True Believer. I don't think it's a bad book, but I think I would probably put it in just okay. Savage Son is not as good as The Terminalist, which I would put up in excellent, but it is good. It's probably even borderline very good, to be honest, there. We'll actually drop that there at the top of the good tier. Savage Son deals with a lot of the fallout of the last 2 books, where James Reese is trying to, kind of step away from the life of terrorism and war that he's been combating for so long, and is trying to just settle down on a friend's ranch, and war comes and finds him. Jack Carr creates this really gripping plot where he comes up with this like ex-communist Russian terrorist type of character who gets a thrill out of hunting people. And this guy has it out for James Reese for reasons he goes into. And so this guy sends like a platoon of people who are going to try and hunt James Reese and his friends out at this ranch in Montana. As with all of these thrillers, they're a bit far-fetched, but it's really gripping. It's really engaging. As with all of these books, like Jack Carr has a great sense of pacing. He has a great literary hand. His writing is very, very good. Like, you get the impression when you see these types of books that these are like, oh, your grandpa's, thriller books, or books like, in the vein of Tom Clancy, or just kind of trashy airport novels. And in my opinion, these books by Jack Carr far exceed the mediocre entries in the genre. I think these are excellent. Even True Believer, which I think is the weakest in the series so far, I still think is much better than many other books in the genre that I've read. So if you are looking for thriller or a modern day military style novel, these Jack Carr books are truly excellent. And in fact, I enjoyed Savage Son so much that it gave me the motivation I needed to continue on with the series. And right now, I'm going through the next book that I have up in the series, but we'll get to that later on in the video. So suffice to say, Savage Son is a great novel. Is a good novel. It expands on the character of James Reese in a lot of ways. It's paced very well. I flew through this novel, and so I recommend it there. Next up on the list, and this is where, when I say I've been trying this year to diversify my reading a little bit. It's easy to get kind of pigeonholed into different corners of reading, and especially on BookTube. that's easy to happen. And I think probably algorithms and whatnot probably prefer it that way, and a lot of viewers probably prefer it that way. But just to in my mind, I'm trying to become a better reader as well as trying to find more books that I will like, and so. We'll talk about this more later on in the video, but I'm trying to read outside of science fiction and fantasy, which is where I've kind of done most of my reading in the last few years. So one of the ways was I put a couple of history books on my list of books that I want to read in 25, and the first of those books was this one. This is Henry V by Dan Jones. It feels weird ranking a history book on this list, but I'm going to do anyway. I'm going to drop this down in the bottom of very good. So Dan Jones is a historian. Specifically, I know he specializes in medieval history. If you watch like those videos that like different channels will do where they have like historians react or historians break down stuff, like Dan Jones is one of the guys who will do that type of thing. And I actually have a close friend who's read basically everything Dan Jones has written, and this, he said, is one of the better history books by Dan Jones. So when you're talking about historical books, my understanding is that it's easy with a lot of books to pigeonhole them into one of two categories. Either one, you get sort of like history books that are written by like popular writers, where maybe they're not a historian, but they do a good job dramatizing the history and, you know, kind of taking general knowledge of history and putting it into a book. And then the other one is if you get, like, classically trained historians. I'm probably not describing this well, but you get them to write history books, and those tend to be a lot more dry. This is kind of how my friend explained it to me, and he said Dan Jones really rides the line between well-written history while also going back to a lot of original sources and you know, taking things from that and not just, you know, popular knowledge of history. So he said Dan Jones was a great person to read as far as history writers go, and I definitely found that to be my experience with this biography of the Henry V, the King of England. So Henry V is probably best known because of the play that William Shakespeare wrote about him. So this is famously adapted by Laurence Olivier back in the 40s, the 1940s, and then Kenneth Branagh had a film adaptation of this. And that play by that play by Shakespeare of Henry V is one of the most impactful pieces of literature on my life. I read it at a young age, and it's incredibly impactful. But the older I got, the more I became aware that Shakespeare really played fast and loose with a lot of history. And so I've always kind of been interested in learning more about the real life King Henry. And so this biography, which just came out last year, so it's a very new book, was the perfect opportunity to learn more about King Henry. And Dan Jones does a fascinating decision, which is he writes this history book in present tense. So rather than saying, you know, so Henry went over here and Henry did this, he says Henry goes over here and Henry does this. And he explains at the beginning that his goal is to put us more at the forefront of what's happening, to give the whole book a more active feeling to it. And like, that's a gutsy move. That's a risky move to do something that stylistic with a history book. But I think it paid off really, really well. So if you're a fan of these epic fantasies that have lots of history, lots of, you know, these different houses were squabbling with each other, and, you know, these backstabbing and betrayals, and the Mad Kings over here, and the factions over here, like, this is the perfect period of history to read. And Dan Jones does a very good job illustrating it. He does a great job writing about it. He helps make the history come alive. And not only did I find this to be an insightful book, but also a very entertaining book as well to read. So, yeah, I'm kind of rusty on a lot of my history reading. This is kind of me dipping my toes back into it. But I really enjoyed Henry V a lot, and I pretty highly recommend it as far as my reading here goes. All right. Next up, we have Black Stoneheart by Michael R. Fletcher. So I mentioned this in a YouTube short that I made, is that I'm trying to read, maybe I mentioned this, yeah, I mentioned this in my last wrap-up as well. I'm trying to read one self-published fantasy book a month, at least for a little while here. So Black Stoneheart by Michael R. Fletcher was my read for this month. Fletcher is obviously famous for Beyond Redemption, which I believe was traditionally published, but most of his other books have been self-published after that. This book was a finalist in SPFBO a few years ago. When you talk about like grim, dark authors in fantasy, Fletcher comes up a lot, and other than Beyond Redemption, like this is his big series, the Obsidian Path series. So I had high hopes for this book. I was really excited for it. Um, I've been told that it's a bit divisive to some people, um, and the general premise of it is a man has been buried alive, or is just wakes up after having been buried, um, scrambles out through the ground, has no memory of who he is, or who he was, or what his history is, and gradually, as he begins to travel through this fantasy land and fight, necromancers and demons, he begins to recover more of his memories of who he was. And it's not clear at first whether he's been like reincarnated or whether he died and came back to life. But he knows he has a visceral, like deep, deep hatred of wizards, which is a funny thing. So anytime he sees wizards' towers or hears about wizards, he just like is overcome with this irrational hatred for them. And I don't know if this is a spoiler. I don't really think it is. If you want to know nothing, then like skip ahead like 10, 15 seconds. But I'll say this, like you pretty quickly put together that our main character here used to be some sort of evil leader in this fantasy land. And so he's really walking through the destroyed kingdom that once he had built up, and the rubble of that kingdom, and trying to piece things together about who he once was and the type of power that he once held. And I gotta be honest, guys, this is a pretty stupid book. It was fun to read. I had fun reading it, but about halfway through, I was like, boy, this book is pretty dumb. So I'm gonna put this in the middle of just okay. Like I said, I had high hopes for this. Let me talk about things that are good in it. So first of all, Fletcher is very easy to read. This is not a difficult novel to read. I flew through this in a matter of a few days. Fletcher has some very interesting ideas for the world building here. It is vaguely Mesoamerican. We've got like ziggurats, and we've got things that vaguely remind you of South American ancient empires, whether that be Incans or Mayans. So those things were interesting. He comes up with some really unique things with the way the magic works in the world, and the character voice, the main character, because it's told from first person narration, and the character voice is at least distinctive. I found it to be pretty edgelordy a lot of the time, but like it's not like I couldn't stand it. Like it's fine. It's fine. As far as the stupid stuff goes, yeah, I'll say it is pretty edgelordy, but Fletcher wants to have really high stakes in this books. So a lot of the magic that our main character tries using. I'll also say this: there seems to be quite a bit of influence from the book. I have it right back there on my shelf. The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. So that's a classic in the sci-fi genre, about Gully Foyle, a man who gets trapped out in outer space and seeks revenge on the people he believes have betrayed him. It's kind of like Count of Monte Cristo, but science fiction. There are some eerily similar things between Stars My Destination and Blackstone Heart by Fletcher. So I found that to be a pretty fascinating comparison there, which I'll also put in the positives. But Fletcher wants to have really high stakes, like I said. And because he wants to have high stakes, one of the things that a lot of the magic involves is a lot of it surrounds death in one sense or another. So there's a lot of like necromancers using parts and pieces of bodies of people that they've killed. There's a type of magic that involves using different like magical items that people's souls are stored inside of, and every time you do a spell or you teleport somewhere, it costs so many souls. And so there are massive repercussions to a lot of the magical things that are used. And a part of this is to help you see just how dark and irredeemable some of these people are. Some of the main characters are, not just the main character, but some of the people that he surrounds himself with. And about halfway through the novel, I realized just how little Fletcher had thought through. At least it came across to me. Once again, somebody else. I know there are fans of this book, so I know some people may see this differently. But it came across to me like Fletcher had done very little in-depth thought about the repercussions of these things. There's not, according to my recollection, not a single scene of the loved ones of some of these people who have been murdered being like, hey, wait a minute, like, why are people, like, vanishing from the village now that these newcomers have come to town? You know, or people, like, noticing, like, oh, you know, every time these people come to a village, people start disappearing. And, you know, even me just describing that, you can think up different loopholes for that, but it was enough of a pattern throughout the book, and this is a substantial part of the book, is them being able to kill people and get away with it and use that as part of the magic, that he wanted these really high stakes but hadn't thought it all through. The other issue, and this is probably bigger in many ways, is that especially with our main character, there is no, we talked about actual repercussions for his horrible actions, but there's no moral repercussions for them either. So our main character, while being very much a dark character and morally gray, if you want to use that term, is very obviously not a sociopath or a psychopath. We see him frequently having empathy for people and not wanting, you know, those who are around him to suffer. And we see him showing compassion to people at different times. So he's not just like a psychopath where he's like cold-hearted towards everyone. But when he's taking, you know, hundreds and hundreds of lives, or costing, you know, hundreds of souls at different times in the story, there's no weight upon him, upon his soul for that. And so just, to me, this book came across as fun in some ways, but very shallow. And I was planning on going through this whole Obsidian Path series, and just felt like at the end of book one, it probably wasn't worth my time. So I don't plan on continuing with this trilogy. I do plan on reading Beyond Redemption, going through that at some point, probably this year. So I'll give Michael Fletcher another chance. I know most people prefer that book, but Blackstone Heart did not work for me. All right, next up we have Castleview by Gene Wolfe. So this is another one of Wolfe's lesser read books. It's not like nobody's read Castleview, but in terms of Wolfe popularity, this is not in his top 5. And yeah, I'm trying to read a lot of more Gene Wolfe this year, and especially some of his lesser read books. Let me see here. Yeah, just checking on this tier list. Yeah, this is the first Wolfe book that I've read this year, so it was about time. And this is gonna go at the top of very good. In the grand scheme of things, you could probably say that this is the worst Gene Wolfe book that I've read, meaning that this is the first one that I've left at a 4-star instead of a 5-star. Okay, so I did a full review for this on my channel, which you can find. So I won't go too much into depth here, other than to say this book really feels like an A24 movie. So a new family moves into this town called Castleview, that's in Illinois, I think, northern Illinois, and as they're trying to buy a house there in the new town, they hear a local rumor that every so often during bad lighting, or during the evening, or during storms, people from this town of Castleview will see the ghostly image of a castle, like up in the sky or out in the distance. And you know, the husband thinks this is, you know, full pish posh, but he actually then sees this castle, and from there, you know, people in the town start to vanish, start to disappear. People from the family and other members of the town start to see ghostly apparitions of people who should not be there, or people that only they can see and no one else around them can see them. And yeah, the story goes on from there. It's a very gripping book. It's very fast-paced. I don't know that it has quite the same emotional depth or literary depth, if you want to use that term, as the other Wolfe books that I've read. But this is a great novel. There's not a wasted chapter. With other books that I've read by Wolfe, you'll get to some parts where you're just kind of getting through it, you know, just to get to the next part. And I never felt that once with Castleview. Each chapter led right into the next one, into the next one, into the next one. You see a whole nother side of Wolfe's writing craft in this book. If you've read New Sun, this is a great book to read just to see a whole nother side of him as an author, doing this urban fantasy, ghostly story that's also a bit of a take on the Arthurian myth that comes and plays a role in this as well. And, people talk about Wolfe having twist endings or shocking endings, and it was literally the last page of this book. There is a reveal that changes everything that I thought about a certain character that had me shout in bed as I was reading. Go, oh my goodness, as I was reading it next to my wife. So that classic twist that Wolfe has at the ending is in Castleview as well. So I really liked Castleview a lot, and I plan on reading another Wolfe book this month. But yeah, Castleview, I don't recommend you start with Wolfe, but if you've read at least one or two other Wolfe books and you kind of know his style, if you're willing to trust him as an author, and that's the main reason why I wouldn't recommend this as the first one, is I think it'll be harder for you to trust Wolfe as the author through this novel than it would be in some of his other stuff. Because you kind of need to just stick with it in this one as it gets more weird and more confusing, and as more things just seem to come out of nowhere. Just be like, nope, just trust him. He knows what he's doing, and much more of it will make sense by the end. Maybe not all of it, but much more of it. Next on the list here, we have Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, also known as The Personal Reflections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. So, as I've mentioned before, one of my other challenges that I'm trying to do this year, even more than the self-published challenge, is I'm trying to read at least once a month a classic novel. I used to read a lot of classical literature and haven't really as much anymore. So looking back and being like, what are some big holes or some novels that I always wanted to read and never did? And what's your excuse for not reading them? You're going to die soon anyway, as we all are. So this Joan of Arc book by Mark Twain has been one that I've always wanted to get to. This is a really odd book in terms of Mark Twain's bibliography. I've read a lot of Mark Twain's famous books: Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, and Prince and the Pauper. I think that's it, actually. And I love those books of Mark Twain. He's got a great sense of snark and humor, and it comes across as a very American writer in terms of his style. I think of those, Tom Sawyer is still my favorite. I think there's a lot of great stuff there. But funny enough, Mark Twain, who was very American and was not an atheist, he was an agnostic, he comes off as very irreverent towards things non-American, and especially towards things religious in a lot of his books. And this book by him about Joan of Arc, who's a very mystical character, a very mysterious character, is quite the anomaly in terms of his writing. This does not feel like a Mark Twain novel in terms of what you come to expect from his style. So this is a piece of historical fiction, but it is written from the point of view of Joan of Arc's childhood friend, who then goes to war with her as she fights back against the Burgundians and the English in the end of I think it's the 100 Years' War between England and France, as she tries to free England, as she believes this is a mission that's been given to her literally by God. She claims to hear the voice of God, to have seen angels, to have had angels visit her. And so yeah, as a 16, 17-year-old girl, she leads the French army. And then, if you know your history, she was eventually captured by the English and then condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. And her childhood friend ends up being able to sneak into England and is witness to a lot of that. So I am not an expert in the history of Joan of Arc, but I've read enough about her to know that this book follows the history more or less closely, to the point that at times this kind of feels like you're just reading a well-written history book, but it is historical fiction still. And what's odd about this book in terms of Mark Twain's bibliography is, with all of Mark Twain's attitudes in the one direction, it's almost like he does a complete flip when it comes to this book. He writes about Joan in a very reverent, in a very, I would say, holy type of way. Um, there's not an ounce of cynicism when it comes to her and her visions and the voices that she heard. And Mark Twain describes her unambiguously as a saint, which is very odd. Once again, coming from such an agnostic as he was, and you just need to read his other books. I mean, Connecticut Yankee is scathing towards organized religion, and this book is very much not. This is one of the last books Mark Twain wrote. It was written towards the end of his career. In fact, there's a famous story, and it might be apocryphal, but of him sort of decrying his other books and telling young boys, don't read about those bad boys I wrote about, read this book instead. So there was definitely something that Mark Twain was trying to say in this book. And to be honest, I enjoyed it. In terms of the novels of Mark Twain that I've read, I think in terms of classic authors, he's held up much better than most others. This one, not as much. It still holds up pretty good, but maybe not as much as some of his other ones. So I'm going to put this at the bottom of good. This is like a 4-star read for me. I still think this is a good novel, and I think a lot of people should read it. But there are parts that are a bit slow. There are parts that take a bit of getting through. So it might not work as well for modern readers as it did during its day. But I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I finally got it off my list. And it was really interesting to see this story retold through Twain's perspective. Anyway, we're already going overly long here. Let's take The Rising by Ian Tregillis. I read this as part of a read-along with Alan from the Library of Alexandria, Ponderings with Pete, and Nuclear Katie. We have a discussion coming up about this, so I'm going to save most of my thoughts till then, other than to say, this is a good book. I'm going to put this in very good. I enjoyed this probably just slightly less than The Mechanical. I thought it was excellent, though. The character of Berenice becomes a favorite here. She's very, very good. The character of Jax is probably the scene stealer here. The way that Ian Tregillis takes the story that was set up in The Mechanical and twists things even further. There are so many shocking moments, big surprises here. Not as much eye gore as there was in the first book, which I am not complaining about, because we have some eye gore coming up in the last book we'll be talking about here. But anyway, to keep my thoughts brief here, we're going to say The Rising is very good, and I'm glad I read it. Next, Moonraker by Ian Fleming. So, this is the third of the James Bond novels. I loved Casino Royale, the first James Bond novel. The second one, which I can't remember what the second one is called, did not think it was great. Moonraker, I don't think it's great, man. I think there was a certain charm to Casino Royale that I think was really good. And this book, I get it. Die-hard Bond fans love it, and even some casual readers love it, but I just don't think these books have aged great, except for Casino Royale. And I don't mean that for the sense of James Bond is an offensive character. I think he's meant to be. I don't mean that in the sense of Ian Fleming used dated language to describe things. That's to be expected with any author from his age. I just mean on a pure story level, I don't think these books have held up as well as even books written before this time. So, for example, Moonraker, and also I'll say this, these books are very different from the impression you get from the James Bond movies. You think globetrotting, you think action hero. I'm not kidding, the first fourth of this novel is Bond playing a card game with M, his boss, and a couple of other characters. The first fourth of the book is just the card game. And then, for the next half of the book, James Bond, his big thing of getting in with the bad guys is to present himself as the head of security on the site of where the bad guys are building this rocket for the British government. So he's head of security for the next half of the novel, and then the last fourth is where it becomes the big action finale. So This is not globe-trotting, this is not big adventure. Maybe with my expectations being adjusted, the next few books will be a bit more to my taste. I'll appreciate them more, but I just don't think these books have aged the best, especially for a modern reader, which unfortunately I am one of them. Um, I'm not saying that these are awful by any means, but no, like the Terminalist books I think are much better, and yeah, I just don't think they've aged the greatest. All right, next up we have The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. This we're putting in, I made a place here for rereads so that I can keep them separate. Otherwise, The Man Who Was Thursday would probably go in all-timer. I read this for the first time last year, and it was incredible. This book is amazing. So I also have a full review of this that I put out. You can go see my full thoughts there. But in brief, this is also a thriller book, but it's also not. The subtitle of this book is A Nightmare, and the book starts as like what you would think as like a basic cop style thriller and descends into being more nightmarish until by the end it is a book about the theological nature of the problem of evil in the world and can God be good in such a chaotic world that we see around us. Okay, like that's where the novel goes. You can see my full thoughts in the review, so I'm going to keep that pretty brief here, and we're going to go to The Devil's Hand by Jack Carr. This is going to go in the bottom of good. I thought this was also good, like Savage Son. I didn't think it was as good as Savage Son, though. In this novel, our main character, James Reese, has to work to prevent a global pandemic that's being caused by an act well, not a global pandemic, a local to America pandemic that's caused by an act of terrorism. You just get so used to saying global pandemic these days. Anyway, Jack Carr is somewhat of a topical writer in the sense of he observes problems that are around us and problems that our country and the world as a whole is facing, and then he writes about them. He does this without specifically like finger wagging at you or punching you with political points, because that's not why he writes these books. But you can tell when you read these that Jack Carr, he comes off honestly like as an angry author in some ways. Like, and if you listen to him in interviews, if you hear him talk to people, he seems very nice, very polite. But when you read the books, he seems incredibly frustrated and angry at politicians who are willing to sit in their ivory towers and do things for their own personal benefit, to line their own pockets. They're willing to sacrifice the lives of men in the military, but also everyday people, as long as it accumulates more power and more wealth to them. And Jack Carr, being a former Navy SEAL, got an inside look at a lot of this on the military end of it, and a lot of these books feel as a direct response and argument against that. And so for people who like those, sort of like fight the power type of stories, that all it takes is a good man willing to stand against evil, willing to stand against corruption. I think these books really appeal to that in a lot of ways. So that's another reason why I enjoy reading them. Next up, we are gonna rank here. This is Pride and Prometheus by John Kessel. That's gonna go at the bottom of good here as well. So Pride and Prometheus is a book that I heard of from Christopher Rocchio. I think John Kessel was a teacher of his or a friend of his, and this sort of reads like a Tim Powers novel. Remember The Stress of Her Regard up there in Excellent, where Tim Powers takes history and sort of fills in the gap with, supernatural or fantasy elements. John Kessel does a similar thing here, where he observed that the timeline of Frankenstein and the timeline of Pride and Prejudice have a bit of overlap there. So without changing the plot to Frankenstein or changing the plot to Pride and Prejudice, he interweaves the two. And John Kessel is a very observant author because he specifically notices that there are prominent themes in Frankenstein that also become applicable to Pride and Prejudice as well. So the main character of this novel is told primarily in third person point of view, and when we're in third person, we're following Mary Bennett, So she's the middle of the Bennett sisters. So you've got the two older sisters who are kind of the main characters of Pride and Prejudice, and the two younger sisters who are always getting off into trouble. And Mary is kind of the quiet one who's forgotten. And so I've always liked Mary Bennett, and that's mainly because of her in the Keira Knightley movie. I always kind of felt bad for her. So it was great to see her in this novel. And then we also get sort of asides in first person point of view from both Dr. Frankenstein and the creature as well, Frankenstein's monster. And John Kessel really understands Frankenstein well. This book made me want to go reread Frankenstein, in fact. If you're not a fan, if you're not specifically a fan of both Austen and Mary Shelley, I don't know that this is going to be the book for you. I don't know that you're really going to dig it. This is kind of for people who are super fans of both. So, Evie from the channel She Was Only Evie, I know is a big fan of both of those things. So, I think this book is like perfectly tailor made for her. If you haven't read a bunch of that type of stuff, though, I don't know that this book is going to work for you. It worked well for me. John Kessel really imitates the style of the day. It feels like it could have been written at the same time as Frankenstein or as the Austen novels. And I really appreciated it. It's a pretty quick read. And I think that Kessel expounds on and examines some of these questions of what does it mean to be human. One of the big problems that we see in Frankenstein is in the original novel is the reason why the creature turns out the way he does is the lack of any feminine company in his life. So specifically, you have the idea of Dr. Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, is trying to play the role of God and create a human being basically out of nothing, which is what God does. But also, you can also see it in a sense of he's trying as a man to create new life without the role of a woman, without that coming together of man and woman in which we see life naturally being created. But then later on in Frankenstein, the creature demands that Dr. Frankenstein make him a wife. And we all know how the story goes, and if you don't know how it goes, read Frankenstein and you'll see that. And so in this book, John Kessel kind of takes that and merges it with the idea of Mary being the forgotten Bennett sister and the civilizing influence of the feminine upon the creature and how that affects him. And a lot of those questions about the nature of, who God is and creatures being made in his image. And if a man creates a creature in his image, how, that kind of flows downstream from that and how that would affect the creature was really fascinating and well explored here. So, anyway, I think he does a great job respecting both of the works that he's kind of riffing off of. So if you're a big fan of both of those, don't worry about that. But I really enjoyed this. It's not like going to be book of the year or anything, but I do think it's a great book, nonetheless. So if you're even remotely interested, check it out, because this book has basically a few hundred reviews on Goodreads, and that's it. So this definitely deserves to be more popular than it is. Okay, last of all, I know we've been going long here. Thanks for bearing with me, guys. And I should have said this at the beginning, but you've already seen the timestamps here below. We have The Warrior Prophet by R. Scott Baker. And this is particularly embarrassing because this was at the top of my list of what I was going to read in March. And I felt the itching, I felt the hankering, and I said, nope, I'm not going to wait. Because if I wait, I'm going to lose the itch, and I'm going to put it off for even longer. So I finished this up right at the end of February, and let me tell you guys, I flew through this. And we are just going to put that right there. There's an argument to be made that this could go an all-timer. But I'm not sure yet, so we're going to sit on it for a while. At the end of December, I read The Darkness That Comes Before, and I liked it by Baker. That's the first book in this series. And I liked it, but I didn't love it. There were enough minor issues that I had with it, or things where I was like, wow, I'm not sure about this. Okay, we'll see. And I have a review for that. And even now, there are some things in that review that I would say differently or describe differently. So I was a bit nervous going into The Warrior Prophet. And this book solved basically every issue that I had with The Darkness That Comes Before. We get more understanding into all of our main characters. Anassa Rimbar-Kellis becomes even more mysterious and intriguing, and I grow infinitely more suspicious of him as a main character. Drusus Commune as the washed up wizard who's trying to piece together all the different factions of the Holy War, is trying to figure out what it could mean if the evil demonic consult is returning, what that could mean for the Holy War and for the world as a whole. And then his girlfriend Esminette, how she's being swayed between different factions within the war, between this pull towards a commune, but also other things that might be pulling her away from him. And yeah, I'm very confused by the people who say that this book is significantly less than book one. And it's not everyone, but I've heard that from quite a few people that they liked it significantly less than that. I don't get that at all. I felt like this book was more streamlined. I felt like Baker was much more efficient with his writing in it, and this book was so good. I'll say this. The last chapter of this book gives us a big revelation into a certain type of evil that has been lurking in the background. It's revealed in the last chapter of this book. And the last scene, that last chapter is not a pleasant chapter to read. It's equivalent to some of the really dark stuff in Moria, not in Moria, in Mordor, in the Lord of the Rings books, and but probably even more if you were to take that but put it into the modern war on terror in the Middle East, so with all of the messiness that comes with that, but the type of darkness that we get in Mordor. So it's not a pleasant chapter aesthetically, but it is one of the best things that I've read in the fantasy genre. The last chapter of The Warrior Prophet was staggering in how good it was on a literature level. I was deeply impressed. And this is one thing that I said to a friend of mine who's been recommending the series. Here, Sway, I've referenced him before. He's been one of the people who's really been pushing me to read this. I said, I'm really surprised when people talk about Baker, they talk about, oh, he's morally gray, and it's grim dark, and the philosophy man, and the holy war, and all this. And I said in my review of The Darkness That Comes Before, I'm not impressed if you try and take this and apply it over onto the First Crusades. I don't see a direct one-for-one there like some people do, and I don't see the religions in here mapping well onto Catholicism and Islam, but that's sort of not the point. And that becomes a lot more clear in this book, I felt like. But what I told Sway is, I'm very surprised that people do not talk more about what a fantastic fantasy author Baker is. The way he's able to build out this world and build out some of these bizarre fantasy ideas, some things that are especially things regarding, like I mentioned before, the consult, are unlike anything that I've read before. And as I mentioned, this book was so good that if I didn't have things that were actively, I was running out of time to get through them from the library, I would have immediately picked up The Thousandfold Thought by Baker and just continued on. And I've been told once you finish Thousandfold Thought, you kind of need to go right into Aspect Emperor because it's meant to jump from one to the other. So, I don't know, guys. There might be more Baker reads coming up here. I know the series gets darker from here. Even still in The Warrior Prophet, I feel like this is as dark as A Song of Ice and Fire gets. I didn't find it to be particularly oh my gosh, I can't handle it. It's so nihilistic. I get that Baker is more nihilistic than George Martin is, but I did not particularly feel like this book was as dark or was darker than A Song of Ice and Fire. So once again, I know the later books have a reputation, but just to say that for this book. I'm trying to think of what more to say about this. I don't know that I'll do a full review for The Warrior Prophet, and I know that there's stuff that I missed in this book. As good as it was, I flew through it. I just had to keep, and I listened to it, I just had to keep listening on. So I know there were things that I missed, and a part of me honestly like wants to go back. I even after I finished this realized that there were things that I missed in The Darkness That Comes Before, and went back and like reread it, and some of the things in the prologue, just in the prologue of The Darkness That Comes Before, that finally started making sense. So yeah, there's a lot of skill as with Baker as an author, and I cannot wait to continue reading his stuff. Like this, if you remember, if you saw my videos on stuff that I'm are like is anticipated reads for 25, like this wasn't even on the list. I had to put The Darkness That Comes Before as like 25 books that I'll read in 25. But this is easily the most anticipated thing. I can't wait to finish reading this series here this year. So what's up for next month? And what am I reading right now? So right now I've got two main things that I'm going through. First is In the Blood by Jack Carr. So this would be what, book 5 in the Terminalist series. I want to get the Terminalist series done first half of 2025 here. I've been reading them for a while now, for a couple of years. I've enjoyed them, but just, want to make some serious progress on them. So just started In the Blood. Yeah, excited to keep reading them, and have been enjoying the very little bit that I've gotten so far. And then speaking of like going through some classics, I have as a big hole in my reading, I'm familiar with Paradise Lost, The Divine Comedy, and Homer, but basically just through osmosis. I've never actually gone through and like sunk my teeth into them and read through them individually. So I'm going through the Iliad slowly, but I'm going through it. Because of Christopher Nolan doing the Odyssey. That was the motivation to start with Homer. So this is what I'm reading through right now. I don't expect me. A lot of the books on this list for this month are on the shorter end. These Terminalist books, you fly through them in a few days. They're not very long or difficult books to read. So this looks like a lot of books, but I don't expect this to be the same number that we get for the rest of the month. But anyway, guys, that is my reading for February. What did you read? Thanks for bearing with me through this video. This is obviously a pretty obscenely long for the stuff that I record here. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching here today. And yeah, I will see you next time. Take care.